Hello, this is Zahir Alam. Welcome you all on Frankly Speaking. Our guest today is Dr. Edward J. Clay. He is a development economist and is Senior Research Associate at the Overseas Development Institute in London. As an economist, Edward Clay has extensively researched and written on global economy, particularly on food security and natural disasters, as well as advised many international agencies and governments on food aid policy. He was formerly director of the Relief and Development Institute in London and a fellow of the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex. Edward Clay co-edited many books, including Food Aid and Human Security, which published in 2000 for the European Association of Development Research and Training Institute. And the policy implications of this study are summarized in Food Aid, Time to Grasp the Nettle. He joins us today in our studio on Frankly Speaking. Welcome, Edward Clay.
Delighted to be here.
On Frankly Speaking.
Yes.
Edward, you started visiting Bangladesh since 1974.
Indeed.
And many times you have visited Bangladesh and you have many experience about the trend of economy and other social changes in Bangladesh. Since 1974, what changes you have observed or noticed or witnessed so far in the current visit about Bangladesh?
Well, truthfully, there have been so many changes that you would have to say 1974 was another country. It's the transformation has been
war-ravaged country.
Yes, and it's really considerable. I mean, let me give one tiny example. 1974, Bangladesh probably produced around 12 million tons of rice and other grains. Now it's about 30 million tons.
30 million, yeah.
I would say then irrigation was quite unimportant. Now probably 55, 60% or more of that crop is irrigated. These are dramatic changes. Another one I would say, which is very relevant considering the current situation, in 1974, Bangladesh was still largely a subsistence country. Dhaka was a small city, and it estimated that probably no more than 30% of the rice that was grown in Bangladesh actually found its way into the market.
Yes.
Probably 70% was consumed in the rural areas by the farmers, their farm labourers. And now I would say it's probably, the figures are precise, but let's say it might be 70%, 75% goes through the market.
Yes.
So these are really extraordinary changes from the point of view of an economist.
Yes. Professor Edward, the global financial crisis is just gripped most of the countries, including the developed world, and
Yes.
we are being at the verge of the economic crisis. Everybody is talking about that.
Yes.
But what is the possible or the likely adverse impact could be in the coming days for the developing countries, especially like Bangladesh?
Well, first of all, we have to realise is that the actual financial meltdown is still continuing. And as you read your newspapers or listen to your programme, you'll know that the President of the United States, his European and Japanese counterparts are struggling to cope with those financial problems, which are unprecedented in our lifetime. Those few who could have remembered the last great financial meltdown in 1929, they're no longer with us. So for all of us, we're on unknown territory. So that's the first thing. And then I think the second we have to realise is that the effects of this financial meltdown are only just beginning to be felt in what we might call the real economy of the industrialised countries.
Yes.
By the real economy, I mean people working, producing things, buying things, exporting, importing. The impacts are only just beginning to be felt now through rapidly increasing unemployment. So to say what are the consequences for Bangladesh, we have to say, well, if the effects on the real economy are the second round, then the effects for Bangladesh are going to be the third round.
Okay.
So it's hardly yet beginning.
So we are at the second round right now.
I think we could say we're at the second round now, which is the way it's beginning to affect. And if you were sitting and listening to television in London or New York, you would just get a litany of gloom with every news bulletin of the closing down of factories, shops, and the impact that it's
the growing unemployment.
And the growing unemployment.
Yeah, job cut everywhere.
Exactly. And so what you now see even there is governments are just beginning to grapple with how do we deal with this very rapidly increasing unemployment. And the second thing, I think, again, it's partly because, as the famous American economist John K. Grobe said, the problem with these things is that when you've got a memory of them, you know how to deal with them. But when, as I've said, we've got no memory, we're really on unknown territory. Is that what we're finding is that at each attempt to estimate what's happened, it's being underestimated. Every time it's looked at again, it gets gloomier and gloomier.
So underestimated in which countries, like the developed world? Or
in the developed world.
Okay.
So if you look at the estimates, for example, of the effect on the American economy, the European economy, Japanese economy, and then the industrialized countries like China, what you see is the first attempts to estimate what the effects were, and now look completely too conservative, you might say, underestimating the severity of the recession. And people are now saying, is it a recession or are we on the verge of a second Great Depression? And the very fact that they ask the question implies that they don't know the answer. And if you ask me truthfully, we really don't know. And also, to then say what's the consequences for Bangladesh, you see, to ask what the effects of an evolving crisis that we're not sure of its consequences will be for Bangladesh, we should honestly say we don't know. We don't know what we don't know.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we don't know what we don't know.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, but you know, our economy is agro-based economy, and we have been suffering the recent times food security problem.
Indeed.
So, in what extent do you think that the Bangladesh government should focus on, especially deal with the agriculture side?
The question we should ask is, what are the likely effects going to be on Bangladesh's real economy, on the textile sector? And then what are the effects going to be if there were impacts on remittances? How will this feed back? Because these are the things you have to take into account in terms of asking what the government could do. Now, fortunately, so far, the impacts have been very slight.
Slight, yeah.
But bearing in mind what I've said, that we're only just beginning to see the impacts on the real economy, what it seems to me one has to be prepared for is to ask, what are the problems we're going to have to be addressing in 6 months' time and a year's time, 18 months' time? Because that could be when those third round effects, if you like, the effects on the Bangladesh economy, could occur. So that, I think, that's by way of background. Now, clearly, let's take the remittances. Remittances clearly are important in terms of providing not merely income but also funding in the private sector for investment, economic activity. So if there were constraints there through a declining in remittances, that could begin to impact on the growth of the economy.
Okay, let's remind you, Professor Edward, that our finance minister, he recently said that Bangladesh's economic indexes are still sound, and the GDP growth was forecast to be above 6% during the current 2008 and 2009 fiscal. But recently, he admitted that there has been a negative impact on the global recession of the country's sector, like jute goods, knitwear, and woven clothing, frozen foods, and many other sectors. In the wake of global economic recession, how Bangladesh can better handle those issues, and which issues should be addressed imminently?
If you think of the international demand, let's say, for prawns, you can clearly see that there's very little that Bangladesh can do about that international market if it's going to be squeezed by decline in consumer expenditure in Europe, the United States. What it can do is to think of ways of sustaining the economy in Bangladesh, which employs most of the people, and clearly I think here one comes to agriculture, and I think a key to sustaining the growth of the economy is going to be agriculture, and secondly I'd say investment. the investment sector within the economy. If one can sustain those two things, then it seems to me...
So how government can increase their investment in the agriculture?
That's true, but also I would say investment in the economy more broadly, sustain investment levels.
Okay.
Because, you know, again, as Bangladesh is now, there's a very large urban sector. A lot of the employment in that sector is linked into the construction investment, and I think one's got to think about ways of sustaining that aspect of the economy too. But agriculture, yes, clearly how does one sustain agriculture? And of course the key to sustaining agriculture is the demand for food.
Okay.
So you have to start there. How do you sustain the demand for food? Because without that demand, the prices will fall away.
Yes.
And the incentives to farmers will fall away, and you could have a sharp downturn in agriculture. Not this not this borrow season, let's say, but in a year's time.
Okay.
So I think those are the challenges, and maybe the government has a small breathing space.
Where it is.
Because where it is now, the impacts are not yet felt, but the real risk is that these effects could be in a year's time. And what the government should be doing now is really having a substantial and good quality programme of measures in place that will begin to feed in to the agriculture in the coming months and say even years. Because if we're dealing with a global recession which becomes a global depression, we're talking about not 1 year, but we could be talking about 2 to 3 years.
Okay.
And so I would say what they've got to have in hand now is not, you might say, crisis measures for the moment, but a really strong programme to address these issues over 1 to 2 years.
Professor Clay, we are talking about agriculture, but what do you think that government should undertake some sort of comprehensive package?
I think the first thing the government has to anticipate is what are the consequences going to be of the measures already put in place to provide incentives to sustain rice production. If one imagines that this borrow season, again, there's a bumper crop, the question beyond that will be how to maintain prices to ensure that one doesn't have what has happened in the past.
Okay.
You overshoot, and then you have problems of prices falling away, and then again disincentives so I would say what the government has got to do is to ask itself, beyond this year, what's it going to do to ensure to sustain agricultural production in 2009, 2010?
2010. But you know, this present government, there are 15.32% growth in food and food grain production in current fiscal. Exactly. 2008 and 2009.
Yes.
After taking measures like they have already lowered agricultural prices to augment food production, the government has targeted this year 33.43 million tons of food grains production, mainly rice and wheat.
Yes.
In the current fiscal, against an estimated production last year, I mean, there was 28.99 million tons in 2007 and 2008. So, what do you think the measures government has taken to have the prices of some widely applied non-urea fertilizers, aiming to help the farmers to stand by them? Do you think this will expedite the food production, food grain, and to cope with the situation for the coming days?
I think this package of measures is certainly likely to provide sufficient incentives to sustain, to encourage farmers through the next borrow season. But if you think of that 10% increase, what you've got to ask is how do you sustain those incentives and keep the process continuing, rather than there's always the danger in agriculture that you overshoot, and then we come back to you will not be able to sustain production without the demand.
Okay.
And what we have to realise is that there are no serious prospects for exports.
Okay.
The market has got to be the internal market, and so what you've got to be asking is how do you sustain that internal demand for food?
Okay, but another thing is the...
So what I'm saying is to go beyond the incentives to the farmers. What you've got to, if you like, is to ensure that the people can afford to buy the food.
So how to shoot up their buying capacity?
Yes, and I think what you've got to do there is to think about complementary ways of really ensuring that poor people can afford to eat. Realistically, the crisis that Bangladesh has just come through, and rice prices are still substantially higher than they were before the big spike in prices that occurred, not just in Bangladesh but everywhere else in 2007, 2008. You've got to ask yourself, how can you sustain the, the food consumption of poorer people? And I think that's where one has to look for a serious complementary programme of social protection, and I think possibly we might say public works, to provide the employment and provide the transfers to people to enable them to acquire the food.
Well, Dr. Edward, it's true that the current economic crisis spreaded some sort of panic, fear, anxiety in every sphere of life, in all walks of life, and we are not also spared of that anxiety and panic and fear.
Yes.
So, especially, you know, our export earnings signs that is in declining trend.
Yes.
Our overseas remittances is also in declining. Yeah. So, how badly it could affect the Bangladesh's economy? It's a relatively very poor and very small economy. So, how badly it could affect by the world meltdown?
Well, I think simply a decline in the rate of growth or stagnation in export earnings will feed through the economy. And Bangladesh is now not just a rural economy. A large proportion of the people live in the cities and towns. And again, what we're seeing, we come back to the way the crisis has affected the industrialised countries. It's quite easy to see what the first round, if you like, of effects might be in terms of reductions, but what tends to be underestimated are the linkages between one industry and another industry, one person's employment, and they create employment for other people, a demand for what other people do, and that I think is the real challenge. So what I come back to, I'd say, if one thinks in terms of sustaining that agricultural economy, what one has to do now, I think, is to think in terms of a rural investment programme, an agricultural investment programme that's kicking in a year's time. You've got a year to prepare for it. A new government comes in with a relatively clean slate, and that's what I think it should do. Rather than be panicked, I think it should take this very, very seriously, take a real hard look at what can be done. Because as soon as you say an investment programme, all sorts of things crawl out of the woodwork. Yeah. Everybody's got their pet project, their pet thing. And what one's got to do is take a real hard look at the situation and say, what's going to work now? What does Bangladesh need in 2010, 2015, and is it possible to see this as an opportunity to do that, not just dig holes and fill them up again, or if you might say, build an embankment that will be washed away by the next high flood in the monsoon season.
But we are almost close to end our program. So, Dr. Edward, generally, in a general overview, what you would suggest for the new government that the programs or the packages or sort of stimulus packages should be undertaken for the better management of economic policy response?
Well, coming back to agriculture, I think one of the challenges has not been yet satisfactorily addressed is credit for the small
farmers.
Small farmers.
Okay.
That is a continuing challenge. Bangladesh is a global success story in microcredit,
Yeah.
but it still hasn't really yet addressed that. And I think one of the challenges as the new programme should be trying to find ways of broadening credit to the small farmer. That's a critical thing, because with that the small farmer can buy the inputs, can buy the implements, the equipment, and that seems to me is critically important.
And with that program, government can successfully or critically confront the possible consequences.
I think that's, yes, exactly, because that's one way of sustaining agricultural production.
Okay.
So I think that's a critical issue. A second issue, taking a slightly longer term view, because as I said, you do things now which are going to have an impact in the longer term. If we look at Bangladesh's agricultural success, the thing that it's not managed to do is rural electrification. If you were to contrast Punjab with Bangladesh, you see in one electrified pump sets, here you see are still dependent on relatively inefficient diesel pumps.
And finally?
Thirdly, I think make a public works programme that draws in poor people, really try to increase the quality of that programme. It's not just the size of it, it's the quality.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Edward John Clay, for joining us on Frankly Speaking. Dr. Edward J. Clay has also identified the challenges which needs to be addressed and handled with due attention and utmost care to avert the adverse effect of global recession. We hope new government and the people of Bangladesh will be able to do that. We thank you for watching our program, and we invite you to watch our next episode. Until then, to take care and bye-bye.